On behalf of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, I'm the director, Lisa Wedeen, and it's an honor to welcome you to this evening's event featuring Mohammad Al Attar. I wanted to thank the Neubauer Collegium for hosting this event and for all they've done to enrich the Reimagining Cosmopolitanisms project. And tonight, I would especially like to register my appreciation for the hard work of Jeff Jackson and Rachel Johnson, who have facilitated Mohammad Al Attar's presence on campus. Thanks are also owed to the director of the Neubauer, Professor Tara Zahra, for her leadership, and to Elspeth Carruthers for all she does to make the Neubauer a vibrant space for intellectual engagement. This night would not be possible without the support also of the Posen Center for Human Rights. And I'd particularly like to express my gratitude to Kathleen Cavanaugh, Adam Avrushin, and Cliff Chan. Last but certainly not least, I would like to thank 3CT's Associate Director, Anna Cyril Jones, who's responsible for almost everything wonderful at 3CT. And we at 3CT are also grateful for the work of Ryan Eckholt and our two student assistants, Heather Welty and Delaney Wallace. So Mohammad Al Attar is a Syrian playwright, a dramaturg, and an important chronicler of war-torn Syria, whose life exemplifies a cosmopolitan imaginary. He studied English literature at Damascus University and theatrical studies at the Higher Institute for Dramatic Arts in Damascus. He also holds an MA in Applied Drama from Goldsmiths, University of London. His plays have been staged in many languages at various international theaters and venues around the world. They include Withdrawal, 2007, Samah, 2008, Online, 2011, Could You Please Look Into the Camera, 2011, which I had the privilege of translating for the TDR. There are also the following plays: A Chance Encounter, Intimacy, Antigone of Shatila, that's 2014, A Chance Encounter, 2012, Intimacy, 2013, While I Was Waiting, 2016. Now, those of you who speak Greek will help me with this one. Iphigenia, is that right? Iphigenia? Okay, 2017. Aleppo, A Portrait of Absence, 2017. The Factory, 2018. And Damascus, 2045, 2019, and the newest one is yesterday, which Mohammad will talk about. Al Attar has also written for numerous magazines and newspapers with a special focus on questions of justice, revolutionary narrative, and cosmopolitan forms of reimagining international solidarities for the present moment. His partnership with Omar Abu Saada has led to trenchant analyses of current politics. He creatively adapted Antigone to make it resonant to present-day circumstances of trauma and dislocation, and in doing so, enlisted Syrian women refugees as actors to raise anew the classical drama's questions about daughterly obligation, political duty, trauma, and heroism. He's also generated plays from the experiences of revolutionary exhilaration and subsequent disappointment. In Can You Please Look Into the Camera, Al Attar showcases the early heady days of peaceful resistance. He does not shy away from complexity, especially the conundrums posed by generational disagreements and familial friction. Activist young people have a kind of consciousness of themselves as being different from both their parents and from older siblings who are too complicit with the regime. The play raises questions about the bargains we make to stay safe and the joyous camaraderie that can be experienced in those moments when we choose to live otherwise. While I Was Waiting, one of my favorites, and some of you have read it in a class I taught on theories of temporality, was performed at Lincoln Center in 2017. Praised in the New York Times as a, quote, subtly harrowing play, unquote, it gets around some of the problems bedeviling political theater by embracing failure and stasis as its central objects. Quote, the failure of government, but also of the resistance, unquote, as the Times put it. As Omar, one main protagonist, asks, how can nothing have changed after all that has happened? And as the New York Times points out, it's precisely this negotiation of stasis amidst calamitous disruption that makes the play so compelling. It's thrilling for us that you're here, Mohammad, and that you will be working on a new play while in Chicago. The Neubauer and the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory will also collaborate on readings of his already published work, and perhaps if he gets far enough along, if you get far enough along, on this new one as well. A few words about the Reimagining Cosmopolitanism project. Dipesh Chakrabarty, who's here tonight, Pratama Banerjee, Sanjay Seth, and I were motivated to organize this project in part because of the state of the world today and the need to imagine creative alternatives to our current situation. That situation, as we see it, is one in which extractive capitalism has expanded its reach to nearly every corner of the earth and every aspect of our lives, in which the planetary environment is at risk, as evidenced by the loss of biodiversity, the effects of climate change, and the devastating and ongoing global impact of the pandemic, even as it's subsided, in which revolutions in information technology, social media, and artificial intelligence have opened up new frontiers of innovation and communication, but also new possibilities for surveillance, siloed publics, toxic conversation, and overall epistemic murk or confusion, in which borders are fastidiously maintained and continuously traversed, not least of all by a global surge in refugees who are unwelcome at home and vilified abroad, in which authoritarian regimes are on the ascendancy, fueled by new forms of racism and nationalism, including anti-immigrant and anti-refugee politics. In other words, new forces are at play. They bring people together while also putting them at risk and in conflict in unforeseen ways. What does it mean to be a citizen of such a world? This is the question our project, Reimagining Cosmopolitanism, has sought to explore, and we're hopeful that Al Attar's presence on campus will enrich this exploration and bring theatrical practices to bear on the key issues. Mohammad Al Attar is no stranger to the University of Chicago. He came in 2012 for a module 3CT was doing on generational change, and he also helped me organize an online event in collaboration with Jadaliyya to mark the 10th anniversary of the Syrian Revolution. March 18, 2011 is a particularly noteworthy day, for as all Syrians know, but others may not, March 18th was the day that a group of Syrians in the southern town of Daraa, in the immediate aftermath of Friday prayers, staged the town's first public protest in decades. Although certainly inspired by demonstrations in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, and Libya, the actual flashpoint for large-scale Syrian protest came after the arrest of school children from Daraa who had written anti-regime graffiti on a school's walls a few weeks prior to March 18. Residents responded by marching on the governor's mansion and demanding the children's release. Word then began circulating that the children were being tortured in detention, and a week later, on March 18th, security forces opened fire on a large crowd of protesters proceeding from Daraa's main mosque after noon prayers. As the cycle of demonstrations and brutal crackdowns escalated, citizens from neighboring villages became engaged in confrontation until by March 25th, solidarity protests had spread to other major areas of Syria. Outrage over disclosures that the Daraa children were being mistreated in prison, over the disrespect shown to elders attempting to negotiate their release, and over the sheer unaccountability of regime officials linked to the ruling family who were responsible for the children's treatment, all tapped into a reservoir of dissatisfaction with authoritarian caprice, official corruption, ongoing brutality, and the government's inattentiveness to suffering. The slogan chanted by protesters, with spirit, with blood, we sacrifice for you, Ya Daraa, biruh bidam naftiki Ya Daraa, played on the regime's slogan of sacrifice for Syria's leader, substituting the tortured children for Bashar al-Assad. This voicing of the national we in solidarity with the town where children had violated the norms of regime-sanctioned behavior made the abused students the focal point of new political intensities in which acts of collective citizenship coalesced around a determination to resist tyranny and disrupt the status quo. It's really hard to describe the exhilaration that people who participated in the world-making experiences of protest felt in those early days. And the regime's efforts to squelch dissent seemed to embolden some Syrians to take to the streets calling for freedom and dignity, and ultimately to demand the toppling of the regime. As demonstrations gained momentum and the regime continued to respond by attempting to crush dissent, the unvarnished essence of autocracy was laid bare, namely its reliance on coercive power to squelch unrest. The cycle of demonstrations and regime repression ultimately devolved into a more militarized struggle, intensified by various forms of international interference, the opposition's fragmentation, and the regime's willingness to pursue a scorched earth policy. At this present time, the civil war that ensued has claimed the lives of over 500,000 people, with many more wounded, displaced, and forcibly disappeared. And over 6 million Syrians in a population that used to number 23 million are now in exile. It's easy in this present context to give in to despondency and despair. These are heart-wrenching and depressing times, and the war in Gaza amplifies the heartbreak, rage, and injustice of our current situation. But there's also cause for some hope. In the case of Gaza, there's a huge generational gap, for example, in the United States between members of Gen Z and older citizens. And many young people have taken to the streets in solidarity with Palestine and with the experience born out of demonstrations for Black Lives Matter. Moreover, in light of what history has taught us, it's too early to think of the Arab revolutions of 2011 as over or failed. I'm often reminded of how the French Revolution took 100 years. If commentators in that era were asked to discuss the revolution of 1789 and 1799, or the one of 1848 and 1859 or 60, they would have had a radically different analysis than the ones that scholars of the French Revolution can write now, with the advantage of a longer durée perspective. In other words, rather than sounding the death knell prematurely, it behooves us to tarry in that temporal space between past and future, to borrow Hannah Arendt's words, for it's too soon to know what the future will tell us about our recent past or soon-to-be past present. Reimagining cosmopolitanisms to play with temporal resonances asks how we might dwell on an imaginary that, despite its past problems and inextricable connections to empire, also invites possibilities for us to anticipate, retrospectively, ways to help make the world otherwise. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mohammad Al Attar to this gala.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I'm humbled by this introduction. Thank you for the nearby podium and everybody who made my presidency happen. It was not very easy with the visa. So I'm very glad.
You're going to need to speak up.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you. Yeah. You didn't miss much. Just thanking Lisa. Okay. Actually, because we had a kind of discussion the last day, me and Lisa, and these discussions inspired me about this very short talk, I hope. And I will pick up from where you finished, the dilemma of despair and hope. So this will be what I'm going to speak about. In the last couple of years, I have been generally preoccupied with three themes. The first one is justice and what it means beyond legal definitions, more as ethics and practices. The second theme is the writing of history or the battle of narrative in times of war and great upheavals. And the third theme is the question of hope. And while I think that I can work to connect the first two themes with theater, as I understand it, as a space to ask controversial questions and an act of political and social resilience, as for hope, and because it's the most urgent act of resilience for me today, I'm still feeling my way around it. And this actually leaves me personally with an agonizing question. How did I begin or how do I began with a dream of theater as a tool of tangible social and political change, and arrived at a dream of theater as a creator of space, no matter how small, for hope. Some stops along the way stand out, and I will kindly ask you, if you don't mind, of course, to accompany me in recalling some of these moments through my journey of making theater that started around 20 years ago. I'm not that old, but I'm old enough. Okay, when I enrolled in the study of the theater in Damascus in 2002 in the drama school, or what we call the Higher Institute of Dramatic Arts, I was convinced it could make a hole, a crack, in the terrible kingdom of fear I was born into, which we knew as Syria, Assad's Syria. I have to admit that my passion for theater back then, theater as a rehearsal, as stage, scenography, acting, was really not the priority. It came later. My first practical experience in theater while I was still a student at the drama school took me to the remote and far countryside within Syria. The project was based on the techniques of the Brazilian theater director and theorist Augusto Boal. Maybe some of you know him. And especially his forum theater. It's a practice that Augusto Boal put the foundations for. And this forum theater, the concept of forum theater, is to bring theater makers to marginalized villages to practice theater with the locals. Boal and the theater of the oppressed, his theory, was exactly what I was looking for to confirm my conviction that theater has the potential for social and even political change in the lives of both its makers and recipients. Did we bring about any change through this project and others like it? I can humbly answer yes. Yet, this yes reflects how my understanding of the change that is possible through theater has itself changed over time. Paradoxically, the more I have worked, the more I have discovered the limits of change through theater. I will jump now to 2008. In 2008, we spent 3 months working with a group of prisoners inside the Juvenile Institute or the Juvenile Prison of Damascus to devise a theater piece with the inmates. Never before had a theater group been allowed to enter a prison and work with inmates in Syria. It was really the first time. When I look back, I credit that prison, as a place where I came to better understand Syria, my home. Through the play, 8 characters, I learned how the cycles of poverty and marginalization form a closed ring, with those born inside never able to escape. Therefore, the play planted many doubts about the utility of my theater. In the months following the show, I tried to stay in touch with its protagonists, the 8 inmates. Some were briefly released from jail, only to return for a small theft or on mere suspicion. The ring was sealed around their neck. The theatrical performance was just a fleeting memory amid hard living. Yet, whenever I'm invaded by discomfort or a sense of uselessness around that particular experience, I return to the words of Khudr. Khudr was one of the 8 protagonists, who in our last meeting outside the prison in Syria told me the following, I quote, "Well, we sure had our fair share of fun and laughs during the rehearsals. You know, the show gave us some hope." Khudr's words left me with many thoughts about the meaning of hope in similar contexts. It was not a coincidence that my last meeting with Khudr came shortly before the outbreak of the Syrian revolution in March 2011, that you mentioned briefly, Lisa. A popular uprising that stood up against one of the most brutal dynasties in the modern era, the Assad dynasty. During the early months of the uprising, we had plenty of hope, legitimate hope, I would assume, that we created in the streets all over Syria while chanting for freedom, justice, social justice, and dignity. Tragically, this hope didn't last long, as Syria will soon enter a dark phase of a bloody proxy war. That is, its chapters are still unfolding till this moment. And along this ongoing tragedy, my own journey of making theater was and still is surrounded by questions and restlessness. In the summer of 2013, I was fortunate to be hosted by a group of young men to run a theater workshop in the small city of Kafrembil in northwestern Syria. The war was at its peak there in that region in 2013. Syrian regime forces were being forced to retreat, and they reacted with an onslaught of bombardment to keep the areas outside their control under terror. That was their strategy. My hosts, who invited me and hosted me, wanted to learn theater techniques they could use in their work with children and teens whose homes had been destroyed and who were now living in shelters with their families. I say fortunate when I start saying I was fortunate to be hosted by this group. I say fortunate because I was able to spend time with young people who worked more than they taught and who practiced theoretical concepts I have only encountered in books. They were able to organize, to utilize whatever resources they had on hand without dependency or a donor, all in democratic, non-hierarchical, participatory, lively environment. No one of them formed part of any political organization. None of them labeled themselves leftist. Most had no higher education even. Before this experience, I was on the verge of despair back then, caught between the massacres of the Assad regime and the rise of the jihadists, the radical Islamists. Those days in Kafrembil restored my confidence in Syria's popular uprising, which had been whipped by the loud sound of war. During the time I spent there in this town, small town, it was clear to me I was the one doing most of the learning. And amid the news from the battlefronts, I was agonized again by restlessness about the utility of what we are doing. But night after night, their enthusiasm, the participants who I was training, silenced my doubts. One night, a few days before my departure, before I left the town, and I went to another town because I was doing series of workshops. And after we finished our practice, it was another night without electricity. Khalid, one of the participants in that workshop, suggested we kill the time by a walk in the nearby fields. Enveloped by the light of the full moon, we crossed into the fig and olive groves that surround Kafrembil as far as the eye can see. Khalid led me to his hiding spots, where he spent days hiding while regime forces attacked the city before they were forced to withdraw. The stillness was penetrated by the sound of two distant shells, a trivial noise on that really beautiful night. I asked Khalid, why would you all want to engage in a theater workshop with me? He replied, I quote, I'm not exactly sure, but when I think about the exercises and games you are sharing with us, and I imagine repeating them with the children I work with, I sense they might catch a break from the bleakness of their situation, or at least be given some hope that their story will be told or recorded, that someone might hear them. End of quote. Once again, Khalid's words, like those of Khudr before him, left me with some hope. He picked some figs from a nearby tree and told me it was okay to simply whip them with my sweater, for they had been grown only with rainwater, so you can eat them without washing. We continued our walk in the fields for as long as I could remember. In the summer of 2016, Khalid would be assassinated by an explosive device planted by extremist jihadists. He was 24 years old. A few months later, two other participants in that workshop were killed in the Syrian regime airstrike. In winter 2014 in Beirut, while working on the play Antigone with the Syrian refugee women who lived with their families in miserable camps in the Lebanese capital, outskirts of the Lebanese capital, I struggled to answer the question posed by most of the women before we start the rehearsals. I will show some picture of Antigone while I'm speaking. I think we have a picture already there. Is it moving? Yes. So I struggled to answer the question posed by most of the women before we start the rehearsals. The question was simply, of what use is theater today when we lack basic life necessities? Entering the open rehearsal space days before we officially started the project, actually, the echo of that question left me again with unbearable feeling of restlessness. However, during 3 months of working together, we managed to discover some answers. In their challenging of male authority, their reclamation of the narrative of the Syrian tragedy, their growing confidence in themselves, their voices and their bodies, and their grappling with the racism they had faced in a society dominated by rigid hierarchical class system. After the premiere, Wafa, one of the actresses, protagonists who performed, came up to me and pointing to a group of elegantly dressed women standing outside the theater. And she said, I quote, pointing to these women, "They used to see me only as another cleaner of their homes, but now they lavish me with praise for my stage presence." I asked her jokingly, "What about the other women who haven't seen the play?" She responded with a smile, "I don't care about that anymore. What matters now is how I see myself." In 2018, while I was in the midst of preparing for the play The Factory, I'm gonna show, yeah. The play is about the scandal involving a giant multinational cement corporation, Lafarge. It's the biggest cement corporation in the world. And they had a big scandal in their factory in Syria. So I did a play based on this. Mohammad, a worker at that factory who had suffered from the management's mistreatment and neglect, agreed to speak with me after much hesitation. I really was like, I tried for months to reach, because he has a very important story, in my opinion, to deconstruct this scandal. And when he agreed to speak to me, I asked him why he had changed his mind. He told me that even though he couldn't do much against such a giant multinational that had joint interests with the governments of major powers, he wanted them to stand a trial through the play. That was a big statement for me. I explained to him that the play does not revolve around the trial, nor it will be a substitute for one. Nevertheless, Mohammad was still willing to tell me his story. Once again, I entered the rehearsals of this production. Sorry, I'm showing pictures from different productions. Yeah, this is The Factory. Okay. Yeah. So once again, I enter the rehearsal of this play with massive doubts about the value and the relevance of this play, while feeling a heavy burden on my shoulders from the stories told to me from many people whose lives got severely affected by the case. Yeah. These are photos from the production of The Factory. Several months later, after we premiered the play, Mohammad attended a performance of the play while on tour in Athens, because he was resident. He was back in Greece, actually. He was one of the refugees who tried to cross, and he was held in Greece. So the play, luckily for me, because he was one of the protagonists, I mean, his story inspired important parts of the play. He was in Athens, so I invited him to see the play. I was not in Athens myself, unfortunately. So he texted me, actually, after he went to see the play. It was a very short text message. He said the following, unquote, "Yes, your play isn't a trial, but it's my first step to seek justice." In 2022, following the first read-through of the play Damascus 2045, and I will show photos from this play. Yeah, this is the play 2045 at the Theater Freiburg, South Germany, where it was performed. So this play was commissioned by Theater Freiburg in South Germany, and it's part of the theater repertoire or season. Holger, who you can see, I think, here in the photo, he's one of the veteran actors of the very prestigious German ensemble that we work with to do this play. He asked me quote, "What do you really want from theater today?" His question caught me by surprise. So I pointed him to the ending of the play, which leaves the story open to possibilities. I admitted the ending was as much about wanting to leave the door open for the protagonist as it was about my inability actually to devise a clearer conclusion. On the one hand, I want to resist the deep pessimism that arises in facing the current reality in Syria and across the Middle East, but on the other, I do not wish to surrender to false optimism and ambition. So this is the play, Damascus 2024. Finally, let's be clear. Today, the reality for us in Syria and across the Arab world is bleak. How come all this unbelievable creativity, beauty, tremendous courage, and sacrifices that we witness across the revolting cities of the Arab world ended up with such a defeat? Above all that, today we are witnessing the ongoing slaughtering in Gaza. How and why I still do theater, thinking that it's still of any value or meaning amid these absurd and inhumane conditions? How do we tell a story about the unimaginable that actually happened, about the inconceivable that did take place? Simply, how do I write about Syria? I honestly don't have a clear answer. All I know is that there is still lives some hope inside my head. It's not a permanent resident, unfortunately, disappearing and reappearing, but when it does re-emerge, I know it's not delusional mirage, but something real that keeps me and others alive. Resisting failing in the deep hole of despair, though we make home on its edge, is my goal. Theater helped me to find hope. More than ever before, I understand that resisting despair is fundamentally a political act. Can we invent hope through theater and art? I really cannot be sure, but I know that we are trying. Thank you very much.
That was really great. Thank you very much. There's so much to think about, and I don't want to take up too much time because I also want to leave a lot of time for the audience to ask questions. But you and I discussed, in some ways, some of the autobiographical notes that you gave today, and I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how the place and time affect your decision of what sort of topic or form of theatrical work you put into production. If we think about your life in Syria before and as the revolution unfolded as one phase, and your years in Lebanon from 2012 to 2016 as another phase, and your move to Berlin in 2016 and your life there now, how would you thematize that in relationship to the kind of work that you've done? Or if you want to stand up again.
No, I'm good. But can you hear us? That's my.
Can you hear?
No. So you didn't hear that question then?
No,
so I don't have to answer.
You didn't hear the question? Oh, you did hear the
okay,
question. Okay,
yeah.
I boom.
Okay. Okay. I have to start by saying I am careful not to romanticize difficult circumstances. But if there is a set and how you make art through these circumstances. But if there is one silver lining, is this notion of necessity. Because I think the best way to start a project is by having an urgent question and necessity. And in that regard, despite against the odds, I feel lucky because the topics were imposing themselves on me based on where I am and which context and what phase of this ongoing upheaval I am. For example, in Syria, when the revolution started, my response was to rely more on documentary theater. And that for me was my answer to this urge to document and to tell and to convey what's happening, because Syria, for those who know, it's an isolated country in general. Like people didn't know much about Syria. The regime, of course, like any brutal authoritarian regime, blocked. They imposed severe media blockade, and so it was hard. For me, I thought, okay, I have this platform. It's simple, it's theater, but I want to use it to tell stories that really happen and happening. Also, because I am a strong believer that theater can tell stories in a very different way. Yeah, of course. You cannot compete with mass media and everything, but I think you can really tell things in a different way, in a way that you can maybe communicate with people and try to gently maybe provoke them to look at the situation beyond cliches and stereotypes and yeah. So that really was what it for me. It came without a lot of hesitation that documentary theater is the form I want to work on. And then I was excited. I mean, I had to flee to Lebanon, and then I was faced with this situation because there was thousands and thousands of Syrian refugees, and I was one of them. So then my questions started to come from here, from my new reality and from the reality of the people around. And the topics were like more or less tackling this great exodus, you know, and one of them is integrating how we came to think about the Greek tragedy, adapting Greek tragedy with Syrian displaced women in Germany, or my second displacement, because I was kicked out from, as you know, like I was forced to leave Beirut against my will. So it was my second forced displacement. I arrived to Germany, and at the beginning I was really devastated because I thought I lost the meaning of the work, because I don't want to end up being another pretentious artist in exile doing stuff about things that happen far away. But then with time, you realize that no, there's many things happening, like also, and things are connected somehow. So again, it comes from my new situation, from the situation also of this continuous exodus, because a lot of Syrians arrived before and after me to Europe, and there were new questions, no, I'd say they came organically from this situation. And the other thing that it happened with this European exile is, and again, I'm speaking about silver linings here, is maybe I start to see the Syrian struggle as it is in reality. It's not struggle limited by local actors. Because in Syria or Lebanon, I was so busy in from within, maybe more or less. But from Europe, I start to see that this is really a proxy war, and it is a proxy, and where almost all the world is involved in Syria, and now all the Syrians are scattered in the world. So it is a case of how you deconstruct the Syrian struggle, but let's say resonating with the degradation of international politics, and that's why I came to a play like The Factor, where I spoke about the role of multinationals in war zones. So this is something I couldn't, I think, came to if I was still in Syria, because I was seeing things from within. But when you're outside, you start to also have this maybe good. It's very painful geographical distance, because I didn't want to leave Syria, I didn't want to leave Lebanon after. Maybe I will leave Germany if they kick me out now soon. I don't know. But you have the critical distance, which sometimes it's good. It compensates because you are not in the, I'll say, in the heart of the way. I don't know. Is it easier? So you are far, and then you start to have this maybe critical distance. So each phase, back to your question, like I think it leads me kind of naturally to topics. Yeah.
There was a video you guys produced early on while you were still in Damascus, in Al Afif.
You love this video.
I do. I love this video. Should we show it?
If you want, you love it more than me. So
Do you want to say something about it first?
Yeah,
to get a little context?
these were the really early days of the uprising in Damascus, and we were before even the uprising started. Like many, we were like young people who are renting houses, because in Syria you live with your family till you marry generally. But some of us were more rebellious, so we left our family houses. Of course, my mother never understood till today when I left, and I was 29 years old. So how come I? Anyway, and we were like renting this big Damascene style house where you have like courtyard and rooms, and we're for people all involved in creative things like an architect, animator. musician and me, and we were good friends. And one of us, we have to give him the credit, Sami, he came up with this idea to make this song. And we were discussing how can we make something at the same time, because from the early days we were a bit sensitive to this kind of tendency to express everything with melancholy. Because the situations, even and in Syria, I have to tell you that from early days, Lisa mentioned even how things started. The regime was really brutal, so it didn't take much time for the people to be killed or detained and tortured. So from the early days, so this melancholy has a context. It didn't came from nowhere. But we thought we need to respond differently, and then came this idea of making a song that is mocking the slogans of the Shabiha. Shabiha are the pro-regime thugs. I don't know a better translation of Shabiha. It's a militia, civilian militia who work closely with the regime. They were brutal, vicious, and very intimidating. So we used some of these their slogans, and we made this. It was recorded in a room. I had the room upstairs, so I was monitoring, and the three guys were in the room, and they isolated with mattresses. So it was very nobody expected this success. And the funny thing about this song, sorry, I would say this last thing and stop, is that many pro-regime thought it's praising the regime.
For them, yeah. There were at least allegedly some Shabiha who were using it as a ringtone on their phones.
So that worked well, I think.
Shall we show it?
Yeah, sure.
Can we turn it up too?
لما للمعتقلات وبالنفط الروسية والحمار الميلاترية نلعب بالزنزانات زنزانات احنا جيوبنا هي الشعر على صباطك نحن كبار لعيونك بنهد الدار انت الديمقراطية مطرح ما بتمشي وبتدوس احنا بنرجع لك منبوس رح نفعص لك كلمة سوس مثل وحوش البرية نلعب بالزنزانات وبدنا للمعتقلات وبدنا نفضي الروسية والكرمال الميلاترية نحن سودك لا تهتم بدنا نعبي الساحة دم الشغلة ابدا مو بالكم نحن عنا النوعية بلا حرية بلا بطيخ مؤامرة جاي من المريخ ما عنا هندوس وسيخ ولا عنا زردشتية نلعب بالزنزانات وبدنا نملي المعتقلات وبدنا نفضي الروسية والكرمال الميلاترية يا مجيبين العالي بشتيك بروحي ومالي ومشان عيونك يا الغالي انا بذبح اهلي بجبرية على الله حرية وبس رح نفرمهم مثل الخس كلهم كم مليون من دس ما بيشكلون اغلبية نلعب بالزنزانات وبدنا نملي المعتقلات وبدنا نفضي الروسية والكرمال الميلاترية بدونك نحن بنتبهدل تطلع اكتافي وتتدندل اعلامك ضرب المندل كشف المجموعة السلفية الارهابية مالون حل مشانك درعا رح نحتل لا من كل ولا من ملة تصير إبادة جماعية نلعب بالزنزانات وبدنا نملي المعتقلات وبدنا نفضي الروسية والكرمال الميلاترية اسمك بالعالي مرفوع وصوتك للسما مسموع لو شعبك مات من الجوع رح ننتخبك أبدية ما عنا رأي ورأيين عنا نورك يعمل عين انت يا كبيرنا يا زين انت ملك البشرية نلعب بالزنزانات وبدنا نملي المعتقلات وبدنا نفضي الروسية والكرمال الميلاترية نلعب بالزنزانات وبدنا نملي المعتقلات وبدنا نفضي الروسية والكرمال الميلاترية كرمال الميلاترية
Okay, I have one more question for you, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. And it's two-pronged, so it's really two questions. I'm smuggling in a second one. So you talk about the work theater can do specifically to help us imagine an otherwiseness to the current situation. And in the talk, you talked about theater as a way to seek a kind of provisional or preliminary justice. You talked about it as a way to build self-confidence. You talked about it as a way to resist a certain kind of pessimism, but also not to engage in a kind of unmotivated optimism. You talk about it as a way to resist despair, to grapple with urgent questions, to forfend against melancholy, to express the lived experience of exile, and to sort of capture the resonances across time and space, but nonetheless in a kind of situated way. That's what I heard from the talk. And I guess I just wanted to ask you what you think are the limitations of theater. And the second question is that if you could say a little bit more about some of the new challenges posed by living in exile. In your most recent play, Yesterday Encounter, which was inspired by the Koblenz trial, you tackle anew the meanings of justice. So maybe these two questions are kind of related.
I mean, as I maybe mentioned briefly, I really start by strong belief that theater can do like notable change in this fight, even to lead to some political change. I'm a different person when it comes to this belief. But I think sometimes it's important, and maybe it's good to start with this kind of utopian approach. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you are not passionate about what you do. Mm. I mean, I learned maybe the hard way that theater cannot make a revolution, cannot really change the life of many people, like of communities. But also I learned with time to appreciate the smaller effects, because I think for a long time, in terms of being engaged in theater or being engaged in the political arena, I was really putting a lot of hopes on big things. On big hopes, on things to be achieved. And I was undermining the importance sometimes of things that happened and we don't pay enough attention to. And with time, I started to focus more on, for example, to work with a group of people. For me, it's enough if the theater piece, because for me, the process is very important. I'm always fascinated more by the process of making the theater, maybe even more than the product or the final act. I think if you can at least make this group who are involved in this process think about things differently, or start to ask different questions, or think about themselves differently, this is itself a great, it's not a political achievement. We didn't really, I'd say, reverse the tide of war, or we didn't really topple an authoritarian regime, we didn't provoke an uprising, but we made something concretely happen in a smaller scale. So this is, I mean, that's why I think limitations and possibilities are combined at the same time. So I became more aware with time to the limitations or what theater cannot do for somebody who enrolled, as I mentioned, in studying theater because I was hoping that this is a political tool, to somebody now who's really interested in the small things that theater can achieve. And for me, for example, when an audience member comes to me after performance and tells me that you made me ask some questions, for me, this is amazing. This is the most, like, really, this is the biggest achievement I can really like. And I start to focus on this. I start to cherish these things. And for me, yeah, they are the possibilities. For your other question about justice, okay, and this is again, I mean, I think after 13 years or so of the Syrian uprising and let me put it like this, very, very clearly or honestly, or like the failed Arab revolutions or the crashed Arab revolutions temporary, as you put it, like because we're still the dynamics are released, so we still see where this will head to. But at least for now, for my generation, we were crushed and defeated and displaced and scattered and you name it. So I start to look about windows where the fight is still possible and meaningful. And one of these small ongoing battlefields, if I might use the metaphorical meaning of battlefield, is justice and accountability. Since a couple of years, there's lawyers, Syrian lawyers, but from everywhere also, are joining force to build legal cases against members of the Assad dynasty and actually members also of other nihilist Islamic groups. They can't, how to say, present most of these people to any courtroom today because these people are immune or they are not know that. But at least they are working on that. And for me, this is it's important for two things. It's preparing mechanisms for the future when things will be possible, I hope. And it gives the people who are involved, again, some hope. I'm always returning to this some hope because they are involved in something that, and really with practical steps. So this is for me why this battlefield is meaningful and important. Other battlefield is documentation and what I refer to as the battle of narrative. A lot of people now working on archive, working on making sure that the story of the defeated us will not disappear. Because one of the first things that the victorious authoritarian regimes do is to try systematically, and I hate to say it, but very efficiently to erase the narrative of the defeated. And this is, it's not a Syrians thing, it's everywhere. We only know the history that is written by the victorious, no? We rarely know the other side of things. And we don't have to wait for 100 years. If you ask people who are still living in Syria under the Assad regime control, they don't know much about what happened in 2011. My nieces, my sister is still in Syria, she tells me sometimes with a lot of agony that she cannot tell them much because they go to public schools and then they cannot speak about this. Mm-hmm. So they don't know much because they were either not born yet or very tiny when things happen. So even this generation, I'm not speaking about that. And that's why for me this is a meaningful battle. Like Syrians, especially in exile, but also everywhere, are working on this road, archiving, documenting, keeping in various methods. And these are for me really important things. And I use my tool. Okay, so the lawyers and legal scholars are working on universal jurisdiction and how to prepare cases against regime members from the security apparatus of the regime, journalists doing documentations. I use theater also to contribute in this effort, without compromising, of course, on how I see theater also as a field of artistic excellence. So my theater is not also an arena for propaganda and political statement only. I think it's much better actually when you approach your work also thinking about it as a theatrical adventure with all the artistic elements. So for me, this really makes things more eloquent or better. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I'm going to open this up now to others in the room. Yeah. All right.
Hi, thank you so much. That's so beautiful and fascinating. You kind of addressed this just now, but I'm curious to prompt you on what you make of the label or genre documentary theater and whether you have any resistance to it and why. And sort of in a connected way, I'd love to hear a little bit about reception of your work in different places and what you've noticed, maybe both on all sides of the spectrum of the reception of your work, how it differs place to place. And whether you maybe see some, what's the word, like misapprehension, like what are like critical misapprehensions of your work that you see, or maybe things that critics get really, they really get it, or moments where you really like feel like it's not quite landing in some way. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. When I mentioned the documentary theater, when I said I relied on that format or form at the beginning, maybe 2011, toward the beginning of 2012, it was really I would say in England they call it verbatim, like yeah. So not exactly, because from the early attempts I didn't just rely on pure verbatim materials, but they were for me really the skeleton, really the backbone of the book. Because for me, I saw my role more as a conveyor, as somebody who create a context, create maybe a frame story in which I can embody the real stories. Yeah. With time, I departed from that for two reasons, and I hope I will not elaborate. You can also silence me.
No.
Please, you should. Anyway, so for two reasons. First of all is that the reality is really bleak. So I thought I really need some imagination to overcome this bleakness. It was bleak and like we hit a wall, and it's very hard feeling. So then I had to think about fiction, and that was one reason. The other reason, maybe it looks like I'm being sarcastic, but I mean it, is that the reality in Syria is more fiction than the fiction. So I thought if I will just present stories as they are very surreal and unimaginable. So the fiction became more realistic than the reality. If you see this twist, but that was really a reason why I departed also from. Yeah. For the question about how audience receive the work, it's a brilliant question actually, and it's a question regardless of any context. All theater makers and artists always ask, and in general, of course, I can say when I presented the work in Syria or Lebanon or the Arab region, we expected different things, and that was because people there, or audience in general, that are very familiar of the topics, but not the topics. Sorry, I say the context. Yeah, the context in which the topics are inspired. While in Europe or United States or Japan or Korea or I don't know where else we presented, like many places, or Canada. I had to think while I'm developing the work that people are not very familiar of the context. But then you have this dialogue because you don't want to do something didactic, something boring, but you have to make some efforts. No? So, and this balance is really complicated. So sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I see and I regret. I say because I believe sometimes to tell less is to tell more. Sometimes you feel the urge that you need to contextualize things better. So you have these nuances. But there is the receptions or the how also come from this fact, of course. So people who are in Syria or Lebanon or the Arab region, I think they for them this speaks about them directly. So that's why the reactions are slightly different. But what makes me happy that regardless where there is also things in common, because people also want to comment on the making and the artistic and the plot and the character and the scenography and that. And this is precious for us. Yeah, this is important. And this is cross cultures, cross context. This is very important for us, because I'm not working alone, of course. Theater is an ensemble. So this is, for me, it's something I always keen to hear. And here I cannot tell a lot of differences, because people are really here asking about the process of making and what they like, what they didn't like on more technical level. But it's very important for us.
Then what?
Oh, okay. Actually, where you ended was one of my questions, which is I was wondering, especially because of how you were speaking about the sort of experience of theater making for you as sort of entering into a different phase when it transitions from the individual to the collective. So from a script that you're working or whatever it is to the group and then outward to an audience. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your process. And on a related note, because you were talking about the importance of documentation, I was also wondering if part of your process is the sort of a curation of a self-archive where you're sort of filming the theater, the play as it develops, and keeping a record, and sort of whether you have found yourself becoming an archivist of your own work.
Okay, thank you. The first part of the question, can you remind me?
Well, the first part is just talk to us about your process.
Process. Okay, so more or less, I'm working in two like genres, like you say. The theater that is I do with professional actors, and this process is kind of classic or conventional. So I take my time, I write the text, and then we go to the rehearsal. And the first phase of the rehearsals is the phase where I'm discussing the text with everybody else, and then I do final changes, and then I leave free. I don't have much to. I don't like actors. Actors don't like me. No, this is a fact. Because also, no, seriously, actors do not like the presence of the writer. It's very intimidating. Intimidating? Yeah. Because they want to play with the text, no? And that's their right. And I don't like actors in general. Without reason. No, I don't like who they are, like as characters. It's a very fundamental thing. It's not just generally. So I mean, yeah. I feel that they are very egoistic, very busy with themselves. It's like big kids, and you have to keep them all the time satisfied. And, yeah. But this is what they do, like so. So it's for me, it's good. It's win-win situation. So I do the changes. I listen to them. We exchange in discussions. They are very important for me also because I start the rehearsals not considering my text to be final, because it's silly if you ignore. Because when I write the characters, most of the time I don't know who the actors. So if I wrote a character named Lisa and you are the actress, no. So this is the first time we meet. I look at you, I see you wearing glasses, your hair is like this, beautiful, right? And then that will inspire me with things, no? And then you will speak, and I see, oh, you speak like this will inspire me about like changing me. And then you will bring your account to the character. And you tell me, for example, listen, I think Lisa in this situation, she cannot respond like this. And then I listen to you, and if I'm convinced, why not? So this is a really important process of finalizing the text. So this is when I work with professional actors. So this is more or less the process. When I work with non-professional actors, which I prefer, but I don't, it's not happening often because it's very complicated. It's where I mentioned the experience in the prison in Syria, the Journal Institute, or with Antigone or Iphigenia. I hope I could. This is the Greek tragedies we adapted with Syrian displaced women. Here it's a not completely, but really a different process because the protagonists are the performers. So their stories will be, so here I work from day one till the premiere, I'm working with them. And I usually start with a very simple thing. I create a frame story before we start, and then we fill it. It's like a puzzle piece. So I create the plot, and then we fill it together. And this is how we work. So it's really kind of collective, even writing. And that's why I really work with them, because we work through, it's usually take longer time also because I do a lot of exercises with them, first of all, to get to know each other, to create safe space, to feel the trust, because most of these stories generally are very tough stories, and the process of bringing them out is not easy. So we work very delicately on reaching this. So there's phases. But my work really is from before the process started, months, and then during video, because we might change things till the night of the premiere. Saying that, it's also very professional work. So also we are very keen to treat them as professionals, and they have populations. And one of our objectives also to prepare them to be strong and present on theaters, not to be just like anybody who's on theater. This is also important. I think this is a mistake that a lot of people who do this job of work, I think they fail with good intention. They rely a lot on who they are, but I think you need also to pay attention to the artistic construction of the work, and then it's to prepare them to be really also good actors. If possible, why not? This is also something we work on. We don't just rely on the raw material. So yeah, this is the processes of how I work. Your second question was
on the archives. Are you archiving?
As an archivist.
That's a brilliant question, and you the first time I think about it. Thank you very much. No, really. I think my initial response, yes, but through writing, not filming or anything. I think now I'm also very. I would say I'm very happy when somebody say, I read a play from you like 10 years ago or whatever, and it reminded me of certain things. No? So I feel, okay, I didn't mean it exactly like this, but at the end of the day, this is what I think what we try to do, maybe unconsciously, consciously, whatever. That we were also archiving, our own journey, our own, this, like so somehow, yeah. So maybe not. I'm not very. It's not intentional process, but somehow yes. Somehow yes.
Dipesh.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. No, I really enjoyed both of your talks and what I watched on the video, and I was very taken. So this is a question to both of you.
Excellent.
I was very taken by something maybe Lisa said, or you said maybe, or that the theater is a site for provisional justice. Maybe Lisa said. And so I was sitting here thinking through the word provisional. And it seems to me that justice, of course, is always provisional. Yeah. Except for God, who knows what is really just. But there are so many moments in human history when injustice seems indisputable. So my question really was, how does one make, I can see how theater can produce a sense of justice. Even a sense of revenge or whatever. Theater can do that, I have no doubt. But how does one make one's play express that sense of provisionality of justice? And would that sense of provisionality vary as you move from one site to another? Like now you're in exile. And you show these things to different audiences. So for instance, if I imagined you in Syria dealing with a Syrian story that everybody is familiar with, and the shared sense of doubt about justice, even the justice we claim, can be enacted. So I was thinking whether this can be done or conveyed across audiences in different contexts, or is the sense of provisionality context specific and audience specific in the way that theater might convey? It's a question to both of you because you're practicing. You're obviously a thoughtful person, but you're also in the practice of doing theater. And I sometimes, and my question may be just too academic.
I mean, you mentioned the word. But I'm sorry, what is, just to make sure I understand, what is provisionality means exactly?
So provisional is like something that is not complete, it's temporary.
Premature.
It's not necessarily premature.
Because that's what I thought.
No.
So then I can.
It is contingent, it is, and understand that it's not final.
Okay. You want to address this one?
You start, really. I was gleaning this understanding from you and from your plays and from particularly the kind of work you've been doing in exile.
No, it's really it's a very good question. I'm afraid I don't have like an clear answer, but it's because it's something that keeps me busy also. Okay, but you kind of like answered it also, like in your question, that like in theater you can maybe achieve these things, but you are achieving them in kind of I don't know, there's like an agreement between you and the audience. Yeah, there's like they know that you are maybe jumping over things and moving to certain places where they are not feasible or doable outside this space, no? But then you need to, as I mentioned before, answering another question, and that's what led me. I mentioned about parting from documentation to fiction. I needed this because in reality we are more or less, in terms of practical measures, helpless in terms of achieving this justice. Knowing that justice, as you said, it cannot be absolute or final. And this is really a philosophical debate. I mean, you know better than. I mean, for those who were dead, or like, what is justice for their families? I mean, this is an eternal question, dilemma. But still, in certain contexts, people can maybe do something. But in Syria, or in the Middle East, because the tragedy is still unfolding. So even taking the simplest of actions is not possible yet. So we have sometimes to make it happening elsewhere. But how to achieve this balance of maybe tackling this without also selling fake thing, or just present yourself as somebody who is detached from the complexity of the reality. And that's why when I spoke about this play, The Factory, which actually later became a trial, not my play. There was a big trial in France against Lafarge, and it's still, the chapters are still unfolding anyway, but there were some actually important decisions that the court reached anyway. But when we started, things were not happening on that level. And I was very clear to this, Mohammad, his name, when he told me, he said, I want to kind of see justice. I told him, this play is not a trial. I was very, at the same time, I knew why he said that, because he knew also that why I'm speaking about this topic is to seek kind of justice. So this is maybe the room of negotiation between what you cannot do on reality, but you can do in theater, but at the same time, what you can do in theater, but you don't want to look like you are detached from reality, or you are being very dreamy or romantic. I hope I answered your question. I'm not sure.
I think you could say more, though, also about the fact that sometimes you write in Arabic, sometimes you write in English. The play that you just wrote yesterday, correct me if I'm wrong, was translated into German.
Yes.
Right? So I wonder also how these different languages operate in your creative processes Linwa was talking about, but also the kind of provisionality, the kind of contingency, that urging that you've given us to, have a certain kind of creative estrangement, but with passion. So how does language operate?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. Yeah, sure. Unfortunately, I don't know if unfortunately, but recently most of the plays I wrote, they were not performed in the language, which is mainly, I write mainly in Arabic. I write in English only when I have to. So I try my best not to have to write in English. So, yeah, I'm still learning English. It's obvious for everyone. At the beginning, when we started to write plays and they were never performed, because before they were performed in Arabic and then translated and they are performed in other languages. Then there was some point where they were never performed in their mother tongue. So at the beginning I had this frustration because listen, writing theater for me personally is not very, it's not poetic. It's at least how I understand it. It's about everyday speech. It's about dialogue, and dialogue need to be smooth and quick. So I don't write with eloquent or poetic language. Nevertheless, you lose something in translation. Yeah. I still think that theater is more translatable than poetry and novels to an extent, because it's about dialogue and about, especially theater that's speaking about everyday life. The theater I write, it's really about what's happening now. So yeah, but still you lose something in translation, not just the direct words or meaning, the hints behind it, the unspoken words behind the words, the sense of humor, these things. But then you have to adapt the situation, and then you have to rely on your collaborators, who are the actors, the translators, the dramaturgs, to find equivalent, that's the word, yeah, to how to maneuver this and to find. On the positive side of it, after this initial frustration, for me also I start to see how people who can't, and in most cases, most of the actors cannot read my original text, how they are diving to the text from their own arsenal of words, not from my own arsenal. This is also a fascinating process to see how they are coming to situations or concluding things or determining things based on their own language. And that's also nice, because you start to see that they are taking the work somewhere you didn't mean, but it's enriching your work, actually. Why not? I mean, they see things that you didn't mean necessarily. So the first reaction, maybe you say, I'm a bit frustrated because I meant that, but then you just shut up and wait, and maybe they take it to a better place. So, yeah, this is awesome.
Lots of questions. 1, 2, 3, how about? Ani, Jason.
Yeah, just on Dipesh's point, I think I was hearing you when you were speaking about hope.
Yeah.
And some kind of hope, a little bit of hope,
Yeah.
Gesturing towards some provisional justice. What is the best that we can achieve now? What is it that we can rescue from the bleakness, that sort of thing? And so I wonder if you could maybe speak a little bit more about the relationship between hope and justice. Maybe that's another way of just kind of pushing that question a little further.
Do you really expect me to answer that? I mean, I'm grateful, but I mean, I definitely don't.
But I ask this because it's, I think all of us sort of think about this, right? Like, partly because you so beautifully but so persistently talk about hope.
Yeah.
I wonder what that is. Like,
Maybe it refers to the lack of hope sometimes, because when you talk a lot about one thing, you are missing it, or you are struggling, or you want to convince yourself that it exists, because I'm aware of that. I'm aware of this, why I'm obsessed with this. But this is very personal, so I cannot really give an answer that maybe speaks about everyone or anybody. I learned again the hard way, maybe to shift the fight, not to achieve hope, but to invent hope. And I learned also that maybe by trying to invent it, in the process, you might get the hope. So this is what I can say. It's really in the process itself. So while you are aiming for something and waiting for it to happen, because this is the story of the Arab Revolution, we wanted the regimes to fall, and that is legitimate. It's still legitimate. But maybe we didn't pay attention to our deficiency and also to our some achievements that we did, because I think there was things that were achieved in the way. So we didn't pay attention. So maybe this is where I am today, that I think I want, the question for me is how to invent hope and how to encounter hope in the process of this invention, not waiting for something necessary to happen. On a simpler level is how to cherish the small things in a daily life. I mean, I don't have a family, but I sometimes see it's a family thing. It's love, it's friendship, it's things like this. And it's how to keep laughing and mocking your oppressors. And there are men in different levels, of course. You have the classic oppressors and regimes, but you have also oppressors like capitalism and you name it. Mm-hmm. How to manage to keep this margin to laugh. Remember that actually by laughing, I'm challenging Bashar al-Assad himself because everything he did to make me really miserable. And I feel most of the time miserable, but when I laugh, I feel like, okay, I have one goal against him, something like this. Yeah.
Great. Please.
My name is Fuad Taimur. I'm an Egyptian-American playwright, resident playwright at Chicago Dramatist. I'm also artistic associate with IVP and Silk Road. And I want to share first that Mohammed's work has been performed in Chicago another time in 2015 at IVP International Voices Project. And I really love the two plays that we picked at that time. What I want to shift the discussion to is international theater. The American theater industry is fascinated by international theater, but we're not doing enough of that. And you go to the theater, it's always the same plays that have been done in the last 30 years again and again and again, and a few new works. When we do international theater, we've done a lot of German plays over the years, and Norway and Danish and whatever. And it is always a struggle to just follow the play because of the different mindset and structure in doing these plays. But it's very enjoyable. What I want to ask you, I as an American, I think differently from the way I think as an Egyptian. You've been a German now, or in Germany for 8 years. Has there been a German influence into your most recent work? And do you see that it's different from your earlier work?
It's a brilliant question. I'm not sure I'm aware of changes. It's more actually the distance from the Middle East. It's not Germany itself. Mm-hmm. Of course, Germany has a strong theater traditions, and I studied German theater when I was in Damascus. You read the classics, no? Goethe and Schiller. And
right.
Bushner and Pratt, of course. And yeah, all of that, and some even contemporary writers. But maybe in the practice, yes, because in the system, this is really practical things. I don't know if you are interested to know about them, because the process of rehearsals, the working with ensembles is entirely, we didn't have these traditions in Middle East, no? Germans are known, rightly so, about being sharp, precise in these things, and that's a fact. It's not just a stereotype. So you learn things. You like some, you don't like some. But effect on the style, it's more, I think, being in Europe and being, as I mentioned briefly, being maybe now I approach my topics from my new position. So I don't know if in Germany itself, I think the reasons that more effects will happen with time, because now I'm a resident of Berlin. When people ask me, I'm also Berliner now, somehow, yeah. I think this will find its effect to my work soon, because I also respect, maybe over-respect, a context that I'm diving into newly. In Beirut, it was not a problem, because Beirut and Damascus are twin cities. I speak the language. My grandmother is Lebanese, so I didn't have this over-respect for the Lebanese context. So I started writing about things happening, but now I'm too hesitant. And actually, this play, the last play, I didn't speak about it, called Yesterday Encounter, is the first play where I have German characters in them. So I think I'm reaching there, because again, I live in a place, I'm affected by what's happening in the place. So I think this will need more time to have.
The factory that you showed, those are German actors?
No, these were Syrian actors.
This is yesterday.
But yesterday, I didn't show photos, but Damascus 2024, 2045, whatever the name.
2045.
Yeah, I started to work with German actors, yes, yeah.
Okay.
But also in yesterday, the Koblenz trial,
Yes.
right? So you've also pivoted to the world in part of German provisional justice, right? And the power and limitations of that.
Sorry to interrupt, do you want to give a brief about Koblenz trial? Because I don't know many know what is Koblenz trial.
Well, no, I think you should.
You should. No, but, I mean, can you, or?
I don't think I'll do as good a job.
Okay, but it's just a real trial that happened in Germany. It's the first of its kind, where two officers who defected, you say? Defected from the Syrian Syrian regime security apparatus, and they flee to Germany. They have two different stories, entirely different stories, because one of them is highly ranked senior officer, one of them is just a soldier. But both, they ended up in Germany in an entirely different manner or different journey. And then the senior actually officer, who was an interrogator in one of the most notorious security branches in Damascus, he met accidentally one of his victims. So and things started from this story. And it ended up by Germany took this step, which was the first of its kind. Now, many followed, actually it's good, is to implement the principle of universal jurisdiction. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, where you can try somebody who's not the citizens of your country in your soil. So you are not, so it's, there's no German elements in the trial, but it's happening on the German soil with German jurisdictional system. So this is the Koblenz trial. So my last play started from here. So yeah, there's some German discussion about this trial also, and why Germany was the first country to implement this principle when it comes to the Syrian cause, at least. And so this is the Koblenz trial. I hope I explain it in a good way.
Perfect. I would have been way
Koblenz
more
is the name of a city in West Germany, just to say why it's called Koblenz trial. Yeah.
You had a question too.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for your really interesting talk and responses. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the exercises that you said that you used, particularly when you were taking on the role of a director or facilitator in working with Syrian women in exile and working in prisons. What were these exercises, and which ones were the most fruitful or interesting or surprising? And then just a related question, you also referenced the work of Augusto Boal, the Brazilian theatre maker and playwright and director. And I wondered whether you used any of his exercises. I can see he's been a really significant influence on your career and on your work. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Boal and what he means to you.
Thank you very much for the question. Unfortunately, I cannot tell because these are about practice. I have to practice this, but depends on the context you build. You build a vision, of course, before you start working with the participant, but then you can change many things. But you have to start with a plan. No, you have to start because you know in advance who are the protagonists, who are the participants. Are they workers in a factory? Are they prisoners in the prison? Are they refugees in the camp? So you have to have a good idea about who are, not necessarily who are person by person, but their context, their circumstances. And for that, you need to bring from your umbrella of exercises the exercises that you think you can build the work with in a right manner. So it's different from context to context. But many of these exercises are inspired by Boal. Actually, he has a book called Games for Actors and Non-Actors. I really recommend this book for anybody. You can do it with your kids, with your students. It's called The Games for Actors and Non-Actors. It's wonderful. It's big books of games and exercises. And you devise things. Of course, because he did. And he encouraged people to devise, not to stick to. Some exercises or games are applicable everywhere, and some you have to really adjust to the context you are working in. But it's fascinating just to end with this note to see that how even when I did them sometimes with professional actors, just maybe they were not super necessarily, but sometimes we needed to improvise to find solution for them. So I applied the same exercise, and they also did good results. But of course, mainly working with non-professionals, it's important how to build this gradually, not to jump to a phase prematurely, because the way you design the steps is first, as I said, maybe this is a cliche, that you have to create this safe space. People are fascinated by it. I hate NGO terms, but like this safe space, to have this space, yeah, whatever. But you have to do it. Like you have to make sure that everybody in the room, they start to trust. It's very important. And then how to move, and what is your objective, you know? And then to move step by step. Yeah.
I think we are actually at time. There is a reception out there, so please feel free to engage in more informal conversation with Mr. Mohammad Al Attar. And I am just so delighted to have been part of this conversation. Thank you very much for being here.